Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
it's telling that the bill we're considering this week, called the Great American Outdoors Act, was written behind closed doors and is now being hermetically sealed, walled off from amendments by the people's elected representatives. Forget the theatrics in Seattle. This bill is the real Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. In its current form, this bill enables the federal government, if it's enacted, to purchase new lands in perpetuity without accountability, without oversight, or any measures to make sure that it can actually care for the land that it owns, perpetuating and worsening our already highly problematic federal public lands policy. This policy will have one overarching impact, Mr. President, to make life easier for politicians and bureaucrats and harder for the American people whom they ostensibly serve. Mr. President, this is not the way the Senate is supposed to run. The point of this body, its whole reason for existence, is to take imperfect bills, bring them to the floor of the Senate, and then come together so that we can hone and fine-tune them, so that we can debate them and discuss them, so that we can identify their weak points and make them stronger, or at least less weak. The Senate is supposed to have an open debate and amendment process precisely so that we can raise concerns and we can find solutions and arrive at genuine rather than forced compromise and consensus. And this week, I've been encouraged to discover just how many of my colleagues want to do just that. Many of my colleagues from different states and from both parties are filing amendments in response to this bill. Some of those amendments would significantly change it. Others would present simply small tweaks to tighten up the language or to provide for better congressional oversight so that the American people are guaranteed that what it says in the law is going to reflect what happens on the ground. These amendments have already been written. They're waiting for consideration. Anyone watching C-SPAN 2 today will notice there's nothing else happening on the Senate floor. I mean, literally nothing else happening on the Senate floor. In fact, I'd note for the record that there are exactly 3 members of the United States Senate in the chamber right now, 2 on the floor and 1 on the presiding officer's desk. There is literally nothing else happening on the Senate floor. There's literally no other business with pressing deadlines pending before this body right now. The House of Representatives is adjourned and is apparently set to remain adjourned until June 30th. So it's not as though we have any realistic deadline with the other side of the Capitol. The Senate right now would simply rather do nothing than vote on amendments that those of us from the West, senators from the Gulf Coast, and from various states around the country would like to propose and have, in fact, proposed. I myself have proposed several. One of my amendments would require state legislative approval for any land acquisition proposed in that state, so that land acquisition would be something Washington does with the states rather than to the states. As many people don't realize, Mr. President, there's a big disparity among and between the states with regard to how much federal land is owned. In every state east of Colorado, the federal government owns less than 15%. In every state, Colorado and west, the federal government owns more than 15%. The average is more like 50% in the western United States, and in many of those states, including my own, it's more like 2/3 of the land. These states, and particularly the rural communities, and those rural communities in particular, where there is the highest concentration of federal land, there is also poverty that's not just correlated with or coincidental to federal land ownership, but it is causally connected to its widespread existence. Another of my amendments would require the federal government to dispose of current federal lands before acquiring new ones, forcing land agencies to exercise fiscal responsibility and prioritize which lands they want to keep under their control. So getting back to referring a few minutes ago to those areas, particularly those rural areas in my state, places like San Juan County, Utah. San Juan County, Utah happens to be the poorest county in the state. It's also a place where the federal government owns 95% plus of the land. This is not a coincidence. So there ought to be something in place that, either requires an offset, so when the federal government buys new land under the Land and Water Conservation Fund or otherwise, that it has to offset it by disposing of land elsewhere. There also ought to be some mechanism in place so as to give the state's sovereign lawmaking body, the state legislature, the ability to accept or reject the proposed expansion of the federal land footprint in that state. It's really easy for my colleagues from certain parts of the country, particularly those living east of the Rocky Mountains, to suggest that, federal land ownership is a great thing. First of all, a lot of people who say that do live east of the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of people who say that also incorrectly imagine that federal public lands are more or less just national parks or declared wilderness areas. They're not. In my state, most of the federal land is not a national park, is not a national recreation area, is not a declared wilderness area. It's just garden variety BLM or Forest Service land that's chronically environmentally mismanaged and that leads to chronic environmental and economic problems. I've also got a number of other amendments that would reform the NEPA process, the process under the National Environmental Policy Act, to help address the maintenance backlog on neglected land that Washington, D.C. already owns and controls from its perch generally thousands of miles from the land in question. And finally, I have an amendment to support Utah's interests under the Antiquities Act. Right now, other states have received protection and are protected from unilateral land grabs by the federal government for designation of national monuments. This is important, you see, because when they designate federal land as a national monument, that changes the way that land can be accessed, the way it can be used. It goes from one federal land classification to another. It's one of the strictest classifications in the sense that it's very, very difficult to use that land or for local affected populations to have influence over that land once it becomes a monument. This is significant for Utah because 28% of the national monument acreage designated within the 50 states over the last 25 years has been in Utah. My state is due for the same types of protections that are already in place in Wyoming and in Alaska. Those in years past had received far too many monument designations against their will. Eventually, they received statutory protection. Utah has borne far more than its share of the burden in the designation of national monuments. Monuments designated that way, by the way, by presidents who were acting in open, willful defiance of the will of the locally affected populations. Now, I believe that this is one of the most important changes we need to see in federal lands policy, and I'll continue to fight for it until we achieve justice for Utah. And in fact, this change could be achieved through a single one-page bill, one mostly consisting of 2 words, inserting the words "or Utah," enabling Utah to receive the same protection from hostile designation of national monuments by a president not interested in the will of the local population. But as important as all these amendments are to me and my state, I'm not even asking for the right to propose all of them this week. I'm willing to set aside some of my priorities in order to help my colleagues pursue theirs. And most of all, to help the Senate as an institution get back to the essential work that the Senate and the Senate alone can do. The Senate was created to be the place, the one place in our constitutional framework where our diverse, divided nation could come together, where we could air our disagreements and find common ground. Every time we have a national controversy, a lot of people throw around the word conversation. We need to have a conversation about race, about police brutality, about freedom of speech, about the environment, about the national debt, and the list goes on and on. These are all things about which we need to have conversations. This isn't just a media trope. Senators say it too, and I agree. We need to have conversations about each of these and so many other important national issues. But guess what, Mr. President? This right here is literally the room where America is supposed to have these conversations. This place right here within these four walls. This is where these conversations are supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be done only on Twitter. It's not supposed to be done only on cable news shows. It's supposed to happen right here on this floor. But here we are Thursday afternoon at 4:23, 4:24 p.m. Look around. 3 members in the chamber, 2 on the floor, 1 in the chair. That's it. This is where the conversation is supposed to happen. It's not occurring. Not this conversation, not any other, not in the Senate floor, not right now, not in the middle of the week. With a whole lot of things going on in the world, we're not having it. We're not even having it on this piece of legislation, which, significant as it is dwarfed in comparison to the magnitude of many other issues that we've got to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to deal with this legislation. We do. But as long as we're going to deal with it, as long as we're being asked to pass it, we need to at least have a conversation about it, and yet that we are not doing. The only reason that the United States Senate was given the powers that we have in this body by the founders and by our constituents is to facilitate those vital conversations. Now, this isn't the New York Times op-ed page. We're not supposed to be afraid of debate here. The Senate is here to provide the venue where all Americans and all views can be heard, hash out our differences, and arrive at consensus and compromise in the public eye. It's especially important to do this in the Senate because this is the place where each state has equal representation. Big, heavily populated states have 2 senators. So do small, sparsely populated states have 2 senators. This, by the way, is the one type of change that cannot be made to the Constitution. It's the one type of constitutional amendment that is itself preemptively unconstitutional. You can't, pursuant to Article 6 of the Constitution, amend the Constitution in such a way, even if you follow the Article 5 amendment procedures, you cannot amend it in a way that changes the principle of equal representation in the Senate among and between the states. So that's why it's especially important to have these debates and discussions when it comes to legislation like this one, like the Great American Outdoors Act, that, while important to the entire nation in many respects, affects some states differently than it does others. This bill has a very different impact in Utah than it does in Colorado or in Montana or in Tennessee or in Maine. Very, very different. This is why we have the Senate, so that we can air out these grievances, so that we can air out our differences, so that we can make improvements to legislation, so that, perhaps we can't improve it. There are a lot of things about this bill that I don't like. There are other things about it that I could live with. But if we can't have the conversation, we don't have the ability to amend or improve the legislation. As a result, the conversation doesn't happen. And most of the American people are excluded from this debate and this discussion, this conversation entirely. This is where these conversations are supposed to occur, where we can arrive at consensus and compromise in the public eye. And this, I should note, is not for our convenience and comfort. Rather, the Senate's purpose as a deliberative body is to add another layer of Republican and Democratic legitimacy to the very laws that we pass. The House exists to assert immediate public opinion on the basis of the proportional representation that they have on that side of the Capitol. The Senate exists to identify broad-based compromise and consensus that is essential to the political legitimacy in a nation as diverse as ours. And to do so in a way in which each state is equally represented. Now that's why we require supermajorities to end debate here. That's why we have 6-year terms. It's not to serve us. It's rather so we can serve everyone else. But right now, we're abusing our constitutional privilege. We're willfully taking the powers of the American people, the powers that they gave us, that they've given us, to deny them their right to a diverse, deliberative, transparent, accountable process. And we're doing this for no other purpose than for our own convenience. No wonder they can't stand us. But, Mr. President, it's not too late. It's not even too late for this week. There's still plenty of time to salvage this process, to flex our badly atrophied legislative muscles, and to get to work. After speaking with my colleagues all week, and frankly all of last week on these topics, I believe the consensus concerns about this bill are as follows. 1, the inequity of natural resource revenue sharing between the federal government and the states. 2, the cost of the National Parks and Public Land Legacy Restoration Fund. 3, the cost of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or LWCF. 4, the implications of an ever-expanding federal land ownership. And 5, transparency for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Now, we could pick just one amendment for each of the aforementioned categories. Just one for each of those categories. Just 5 amendments altogether. And by so doing, make significant progress on this legislation. And more than that, we could strengthen our legislative muscle memory and take a step towards restoring the rightful deliberative powers of this body. The Senate has long called itself the world's greatest deliberative body. These days, when it doesn't debate, when it shuts out amendments from individual members, keeping in mind that this is supposed to be one of the 2 fundamental rules of the Senate. Each member has access to unlimited debate and unlimited amendments. When it does this, it's neither great nor deliberative. It's not living up to its name, to its history, to its traditions, to its capacity, or to its constitutional purpose. 5 amendments are not a lot, Mr. President, especially considering this legislative text bypass the committee process altogether in the first place. This bill, as a bill, was never even processed by the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on which I serve. It bypassed that committee altogether. It didn't go through it. But even if the Senate votes on these amendments and votes them down, notwithstanding the fact that we bypassed the committee, it's here now. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it has to go through committee. It's better if we do. We didn't here. We can still deal with some of the concerns that individual members have. This is the appropriate place to do that, after all, with or without committee action. Regardless of the outcome of those votes, even if the Senate votes those amendments down, every one of them. At least we will then be on record about our priorities and about our positions. At least then we'll have a chance to weigh in and say, here's what I liked about the bill, here's what I didn't like about the bill. That, in turn, helps us communicate with the public about why we either do or don't support whatever legislation is intact at the end of that process.